I perused through an old article this morning, a special from The Atlantic on Andrew Anglin. The piece was written more than a year ago, and I had neglected it at the time of its publication, despite making the rounds in politically right-wing circles. In reading it, I remember why I had ignored it and why I should have continued to ignore it. The article is, or rather was, demonstrative of a trend in journalism in which the meat of the writing is not in the facts or the sequencing of events, but rather lies in leading hedges. So-called, allegedly, self-proclaimed, and a variety of other diminutive descriptors are appended to the words and descriptions of one side of the story and omitted from the other. And perhaps the most obvious one is putting words in quotation marks, which are neither direct quotes nor unfamiliar words being defined, nor an article, nor a song title. The quotation marks are intended only to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the term in question. And this is something that Steven Pinker joked about in The Sense of Style, citing some writers' tendency to do this unintentionally, i.e., he thought she was beautiful. But with modern journalism, you see, the effect is very much intentional. Consider the following paragraph from the Atlantic piece. Quote, "The calls marked the start of a months-long campaign of harassment orchestrated by Andrew Anglin, the publisher of the world's biggest neo-Nazi website, The Daily Stormer. He claimed that Gersh was trying to extort a property sale from Sherry Spencer, whose son, Richard Spencer, was another prominent white nationalist and the face of the so-called alt-right movement." Now, what we have here are two sentences representing two different perspectives. The first sentence represents the perspective of the journalist, simply observing facts. The calls is the subject, and the ending clause, Andrew Anglin, the publisher through the Daily Stormer, is the object being acted upon, meaning the perspective is, in the writing vernacular, an omniscient third-person observer narrator. It's a fancy way of saying the reader is a smart, objective, and most of all, reliable interpreter of events. Now, contrast this with the second sentence. There are three different leading hedges crammed into this single sentence. He claimed that Gersh was trying to extort a property sale from Sherry Spencer, whose son, Richard Spencer, was another prominent white nationalist and the face of the so-called, there aren't any quotation marks, but highlighting that, the so-called alt-right movement. End quote. Now, objectively speaking, there's nothing factually inaccurate about this sentence. Despite the difference in connotation, claim is, if we are being technical, a synonym for said. Anglin probably did use the word extort, but quotes around isolated, morally charged words are almost always used to cast doubt on the legitimacy of the word. Saying, he said that Gersh was trying to extort a property sale, without quotation marks, conveys Anglin's sentiments with the exact same precision, only omitting the author's personal feelings. And of course, every pop journalist's favorite hedge, so-called. Now, if you Google search so-called, the first two definitions that pop up are as follows. 1. Used to show that something or someone is commonly designated by the name or term specified. 2. Used to express one's view that a name or term is inappropriate. Now, I leave it to the viewer to imagine what the advantages of using so-called over known as, or commonly called, or any other synonym that does not have the second definition attached to it. Anyways, what is added with the phrase so-called? What's the difference between the following two versions? Quote, another prominent white nationalist in the face of the alt-right movement, and another prominent white nationalist in the face of the so-called alt-right movement. Nothing. Nothing is added except judgment. Now, to be clear, judgment is an old and perhaps integral part of writing. Journalists who are dedicated to the facts first may have different standards. But The Atlantic is more of a commentary magazine than a journalistic one. Judgment and opinions are a part of the genre and a part of the purpose of the writing. But there are two problems with the manner in which judgment is injected into the commentary of modern journalism. First, it is oblique, disguised under the pretense of objectivity or mere facts. And second, the style itself has become so integral to the way in which modern pundits write that it seems to have affected their ability to think clearly. Now, the manner in which personal judgment and skepticism is presented as if it were factual is the purpose of a leading hedge. There's no other reason to do it. It is almost subliminal, a kind of associative feeling the reader is intended to ascribe to the object in question, but without dwelling too long on the source of the description or the reason for the association. Now, this kind of leading treats the reader as someone who cannot come to conclusions on their own. Despite presenting an array of facts relating to the subject, an array which the author should believe to be conclusive in favor of their own opinion, they nevertheless inject these sneaky little primers into their sentences in what appears to be a compulsive, habitual manner. Of course, leading hedges are the more clever kind of priming, but they're not the only kind. Writers will often attach more overt descriptive adjectives like white supremacist, neo-Nazi, racist, Islamophobic, or communist, and simply overwhelm the reader with these more blunt literary implements. Consider, by way of illustration, this following little news tidbit. Quote, "White supremacist Representative Steve King endorses white supremacist Faith Goldy for Toronto mayor." The Canadian anti-Semite has recited a neo-Nazi slogan appearing on a neo-Nazi podcast and endorsed a book calling for the elimination of Jews. A man who spouts white supremacist views from his perch in Congress has endorsed another white supremacist vying to become Toronto's next mayor. Representative Steve King, Republican, Iowa, on Monday tweeted out his support of Faith Goldy, a far-right white nationalist who is looking to lead Canada's largest city. Faith Goldy, an excellent candidate for Toronto mayor, pro-rule of law, pro-make Canada, sorry about that, safe again, pro-balanced budget, and, best of all, pro-Western civilization and a fighter for our values, King tweeted. He added that the mayoral candidate will not be silenced. End quote. Just a cursory walk through this incredible little masterpiece. Not one allegation of white supremacism in the headline, but two. Now, interestingly, the claim that King is a white supremacist appears to be based on his concerns about immigration in Europe. Now, the basis for calling Faith Goldy a white supremacist seems to be based upon her willingness to talk with the Daily Stormer, a crime of association which, if one were to be consistent, might also condemn Luke O'Brien of the Atlantic piece on Andrew Anglin, which I was referencing earlier. Now, many of the claims, getting more serious here, many of the claims are tenuous at best, if not outright false, and most of them are simply irrelevant. But their purpose is not to inform or to give relevant and true facts pertinent to the subject. They are simply to build a rock-solid emotional association so that the reader will respond to in the desired manner to respective stimuli. The fact that they are compulsive and habitual in their writing style here is not just a function of their persuasive purpose. And here it helps to understand some of the writing industry and how these people are paid and how they do their job. So-called is also a space filler. It's a cheap 9-character space filler that makes the writing sound punchy and critical and implies a promise to explain how the hedged object's name is, for whatever reason, inappropriate. And it also cannot be falsified. Whatever object is so-called is indeed called so, at least by someone. Now, if these injections are habitual and compulsive, rather than conscious additions, which I believe them to be, then their effects are not limited to the readers, but to the writers themselves. Consider the following quote from George Orwell here. Quote, "Now it is clear that the decline of language must ultimately have political and economic causes. It is not due simply to the bad influence of this or that individual writer. But an effect can become a cause, reinforcing the original cause and producing the same effect in an intensified form, and so on indefinitely. A man may take to drink because he feels himself to be a failure, and then fail all the more completely because he drinks. It is rather the same thing that is happening to the English language. It becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish, but the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts." And that's from Politics in the English Language. To failure. Now, both the disguised nature of the bias and its effect on the thinking of the writer produce commentary that makes people stupid. There's no other way to put it. It makes them unable to accurately and critically evaluate facts and draw their own conclusion from them, because the saturation of the presented writing with leading hedges creates an overwhelming moralistic sense of the presented position, which is that it's not just correct, but is good in the moral sense. Moralizing makes a position unchallengeable. No one has a problem saying, "I'm not sure if that's true," but it becomes socially hazardous to go against what is deemed to be good and evil. And of course, the subliminal priming works. If people don't notice it, the leading hedges can and do result in people accepting positions and conclusions which, if questioned about them, they often cannot give reasons for. Sometimes they don't even remember how or why they hold these positions. But if challenged, they have no trouble moralizing about it, especially if you disagree. And sometimes this works even if you do see the leading hedges. But anyhow, let's fast forward to today. There's been a fair bit of interest over this new NPC meme, which describes mainstream media consumers, especially liberals and progressives, as non-playable characters, or NPCs, which are the sort of bots on computer games and so on, which are famous for their scripted dialogues and generally poor observation and reasoning skills. They can't do anything they haven't been programmed to do, you see. Twitter, for example, has been banning thousands of accounts from making reference to this meme, and some progressives are even calling it dehumanizing. And to their credit, it is pretty insulting. But is it unwarranted? So far as I can tell, those who follow the professional pundits and clever commentators gradually do take on these irritating attributes of unmanned bots, regurgitating scripted lines, and are unable to deal with criticisms or alternatives that have not been pre-scripted by their proverbial programmers. In short, some news makes people stupid. Obviously, not all outlets are uniform in their stupefying nature. On Fox News, for example, I find Tucker Carlson's interviews to be interesting and sometimes even informative, while Sean Hannity's opening monologue seems to be just a hodgepodge of conservative buzzwords and groupthink amalgamated into a rambling diatribe. The title suits the content, I suppose. Opening monologue. Those who swallow this without chewing are not doing themselves any intellectual favors. They'd be better off with keeping up with the Kardashians, which at least makes no pretense to political profundity. But the greater point, as Orwell would say, is that the process is reversible. If you keep an eye out for these leading hedges, I guarantee you will find no shortage of them. While being able to see them is not an inoculation per se, it is a defense of sorts. Perhaps more importantly, it reveals bad writing and can help the reader be more discerning and equipped to identify poor writing and, by extension, poor reasoning. And perhaps, after enough time, you can accumulate a list of sources which genuinely makes you smarter, or at least less easily programmed.